Lunchtime had arrived at the company where I work, and I was heading to the dining room like every day. I was looking at a yellowish mess on my tray that I didn't know it was egg or potato when someone called my name. "Hey, Becky!" She was Mia, one of my co-workers. It's not that we were soulmates, but she was one of the few people I liked in that company. We always waited for each other on breaks and ate together in the cafeteria. So I turned around and walked away. I headed to their table. Samantha, another of the workers, was sitting next to her. They seemed to be discussing some half-secret topic because they were talking in a low voice, so that the other colleagues couldn't hear their conversation. Of course, I asked them. Mia waved her hands, putting tension on the matter. "Haven't you heard the rumors? Another woman was attacked in the shopping center parking lot." I frowned in confusion. Again? I didn't know there was already more than one victim. After the 2 years that I was hospitalized for health reasons, I was quite far from the media. The two girls looked at each other and then at me in disbelief, as if I had missed the news of the century. "Don't you know? According to what they say, she's the 4th victim in just 2 weeks." Since it still didn't mean anything to me, Mia began to explain. This all started a few weeks ago. The first victim was likely a young woman who was shopping at Walmart. It was almost dark when she left the mall, so there weren't too many people in the parking lot. I think it must have been right at the time of closing, when the supermarket no longer allows entry, but there are still the last customers putting their purchases in the trunk. Or at least, that's what I think. What I didn't know was that that famous criminal was hiding under cars. And all the victims attacked had been women and with a red car. Either they were his goal or a great coincidence. I shifted in my chair and swallowed the food in my mouth with difficulty. My car was also red, and I used to make my purchases at that same Walmart. My partner continued to recount the event, saying that the criminal was waiting under the car while the women calmly made their purchase. Once they arrived with the car full, they left the items in the trunk and then walked to the driver's door. But just when they were about to enter, rush! A hand shot out from under the car and cut both their heels with a knife. After the cut, the women fell to the ground, leaving them completely defenseless. That depraved man could do whatever he wanted with them because they couldn't flee. "Oh, I hope he only did it to rob them and not to do anything else to them," Samantha exclaimed as she closed her eyes in anguish. I swallowed hard the next bite in my mouth and asked them how they found out. They quietly confessed to me that the person in charge of Walmart had told them. He was one of the few people who knew, because they didn't want the news to spread throughout the city and spread panic. In the days that followed, the mall killer became the #1 topic of conversation at our company. The rumors spread like wildfire. Everyone knew about him. I heard countless stories of people who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone. And although in my head I had created the idea that it was nothing more than an urban legend that some small group had invented to scare women, I couldn't escape with each new story and each new version of that murderer. Soon, I found myself looking under my car from afar every time I was in a supermarket parking lot. In the end, it happened to me in other places too. One night, I even had to look under the bed before I dared approach her. It was exasperating. I was upset with myself for letting the rumors get to me, even though I knew they weren't true. However, a few days later, I realized how wrong I was. During the last few days, I had avoided Walmart and had done my shopping in other shopping centers farther away. But that day, I decided to skip that nonsense, and since I didn't need much, I drove to my usual supermarket. When I finally left the mall, carrying shopping bags, I was shocked. It was night and everything was dark. In front of me, the parking lot was deserted. It wasn't unusual because it was close to closing time. The shocking thing was that I had lost track of time inside and I didn't know it was so late. With some anguish, I headed to my car. I tried to appear as confident as possible. If there was someone around, I didn't want them to see me as scared. To make matters worse, I noticed that the street lights I had parked under was broken. No matter how hard I tried, all I could see was darkness beneath my car. I felt my pulse quicken. My breathing became heavy with every step I took towards it. But still, I forced myself to walk slowly so as not to show any weakness. With a balancing act I could probably use at a circus, I somehow managed to get the car remote out of my bag, even though my arms were full. Although normally in these situations I close my eyes and run away, I kept creating stories in my head and imagining arms coming out from under the car. With a trembling hand, I pressed the button on the car remote. The trunk was open, but I still wasn't safe. Not caring if I crushed any delicate purchases, I quickly tossed the bags inside. And without closing the door, I immediately jumped back, putting a safe distance between me and my car. Meanwhile, I could clearly hear my pulse beating in my ears. I slowly crouched on the ground. I was finally able to see the underside of my vehicle. There was no one. An embarrassing laugh left my mouth, and I shook my head as I stood up. There was no one there. Of course not. How could I be so stupid? There was no murderer in the mall. Feeling like my heart was several pounds lighter, I walked back to my trunk and slowly closed it. Then I continued to the driver's door. There, without further ado, I opened the door. I was about to sit down when suddenly a scream echoed through the parking lot. I was frozen. That was the voice of a woman. She screamed shrilly until suddenly something drowned out her screams. For a few seconds that seemed like minutes, I began to weigh all kinds of possibilities, trying to choose the best one without coming out wrong. What should I do? Should I escape and get to safety, or should I see what's going on? Help the woman? I closed my eyes for a few more seconds, even though I had already made a decision. The muffled screams came from another part of the parking lot. I had to turn a corner to see him. There, I saw a figure crouching on the ground next to one of the cars. When he noticed my footsteps, he raised his head, jumped up, and ran in the opposite direction. Almost immediately, the screams became louder again. "Help! Help me!" screamed the terrified woman who was lying on the ground where the figure had just crouched. I ran to her and asked what had happened to her, but she didn't have to answer. I knew as soon as I saw the blood on her feet. The man had cut her heels. The mall killer was real. And who knows what he would have done to the woman if I hadn't been there. Panicked that he might do something to me, I ran out of there. Not before having called the emergency services and telling them what happened. That situation had made me very nervous and had removed my past traumas. I tried to breathe slowly several times and remember the advice I had been given at the center during my recovery. Everything was fine. I had gotten rid of that murderer and I had to celebrate. So I went to release tension with my favorite hobby. After feeling more relieved, I headed to a bar for a drink. That situation had left me with a dry throat. Finally, I found a place. A dark, gloomy place, but also deserted. The waiter was completely alone at one end, watching a football game. I sat at the bar and placed the bag I had with me next to me. I ordered a soft drink. Before the owner had a chance to return to his game, another customer walked in. "Give me a double whiskey." The customer was a thin, long-haired man in his 40s with wrinkles and dirty clothes. He was wearing a coat and a bag, black, bulky, very similar to mine. As I watched him, he carefully placed it on the adjacent stool and reached for his glass. He threw his head back and swallowed. I could see the movement of his Swedish neck. Then he pushed the empty glass away while he asked the owner for another glass of whiskey and took out a handful of bills from his pocket. The waiter's expression was a mix of grimace and smile, but when he saw the bills raining down on the bar, he smiled. He shrugged his shoulders and refilled the glass with alcohol. I knew what he was thinking. If he asked me for beer, I'd tell him to go to hell, but he's paying for whiskey, so hold on. The second glass came down almost as quickly as the first, and he ordered a third. The waiter came back, served him, grabbed the money, and put it in the cash register. I watched the third glass disappear. The stranger's neck was now bright red. 3 glasses of whiskey in 2 minutes also made him lose his tongue, and he began to grumble and start a conversation with me. "Always the same football. God, what kind of hobby is that? Who can be entertained by watching a group of monkeys fighting to kick a ball?" I answered that it was a hobby, but that we were all different. We each had different ways of entertaining ourselves. Maybe he understood me, maybe he didn't, but he nodded his head. Then he asked me what I thought about hunting and fishing. I told him I had no opinion about it. He laughed and joined the conversation. He told me that it was one of his favorite hobbies, although for many it had become just another form of murder, taking a gun and killing an animal, or putting a hook in a fish and making it suffer, for the simple fact of enjoying the hobby of fishing and throwing it back into the sea. I was interested in his reasoning and asked him if killing was justified if it created pleasure in the person. He looked at his empty glass and told me it depended on who. If you made someone who no one would miss without family, like a beggar, it wasn't right, but the person could do it without anyone noticing. No one would miss him and no one would put the city on alarm. I leaned forward and looking at him intently, I asked, "And do you think someone could do something like that?" He didn't look at me, just looked at his bag before answering. "Well, I was thinking about a criminal who used to do it, here in the city too. But that was about 2 years ago. Nothing has been heard from him again." I asked him if he knew who he was, and he said no, that no one knew him. And that was the good thing. That's why he had always gotten away. The police had gone crazy trying to find him. They assumed he was someone from the city, but those were just assumptions. They never had the slightest clue as to his whereabouts. The criminal found some unfortunate person or lured a homeless person into an alley. He promised to give them a bottle of something, and then he cut off their heads. I stood up and reached for the bag. The man laughed and told me not to be afraid. He was sure that the guy was no longer in town. He had gotten tired of the area, or maybe they were about to catch him, and decided to walk away. Afterwards, he came very close to me, so much so that I felt threatened, and he told me, "People have the right to have hobbies, don't you think?" I opened my mouth to answer him, but before I could do so, I heard another noise, the hum of a siren on the street. The man at the bar raised his head. The three of us had realized that they were coming there. The man jumped to his feet and headed for the door. I ran after him and told him, "Hey, don't forget your bag." Without even looking at me, he grabbed the plastic bag and left with a hasty step, getting lost in an alley between two nearby buildings. In a moment, he disappeared. I stood at the door of the bar as the siren sounded closer and closer, making my ears hurt. A patrol car stopped in front of me and another behind me, but neither of them stopped the engine. Two police officers got out and looked at all sides of the road. Inside the bar, they looked at me. Then they asked me if I had seen a man who looked unkempt, thin, with long hair and dirty. I had to tell him the truth, of course. "Yeah, he left here a minute ago." They asked me which direction and I pointed between the two buildings. One of the police officers gave orders to the two patrol cars and they started and headed to the direction I indicated. The other two police officers stayed in the bar asking us questions. One of them was the sergeant. They escorted me inside and told me it was the mole killer. Some companions had followed him secretly without uniform to go unnoticed. I took a deep breath, letting the police officers hear it. I told them I had talked to him while I was drinking my soda, but I had no idea he was a criminal. One of the police officers looked at my bag and remembered that the notice was that the murderer also had one with him. The sergeant asked me if I had noticed if he had taken it or left it there. I nodded to him that he had taken his bag with him. A few minutes later, the police officer's walkie rang. They were his companions who had managed to catch the criminal.
Enemy down!
Unfortunately, in the struggle to capture him, he had been injured by one of the police officers while protecting himself, and the criminal had died. The sergeant snorted. That was a big problem, and he would have to give a lot of explanations to the judge. But finally, all those crimes in the city were over. Shortly after, another police officer entered with the bag. The sergeant took it from his hands and placed it on the bar. "Was this the one he had?" he asked me. I nodded, feeling like my voice was sticking in my throat. I turned around. I didn't want to see how the sergeant opened the bag, nor did I want to see their faces when they looked inside. But naturally, I heard them. I think two of them got dizzy. There was a human head. I gave the sergeant my official statement as he requested. They took note of everything and made me sign. I told him about the conversation with a stranger, the whole theory of murder as a hobby, the idea of choosing unfortunate people as victims because no one would miss them. I told him that I didn't think he was being serious. It was just the ramblings of a person who had gone too far with alcohol. The sergeant replied, "He was probably telling you the way a murderer's mind works." 2 years ago, several murderers emerged, but then he stopped killing. I think he left town when things got tough. Then he felt the need to start over, and everything agrees that it was him. That murderer and the one from the shopping center were the same person. I imagine he noticed my expression because he rested his hand on my shoulder. "Forgive me, I understand how you feel. You are in great danger talking to him. You've probably been with the smartest psychopathic killer who ever lived. Consider yourself lucky." I nodded and headed to the door. I agreed with the sergeant about the risk taken and about the most intelligent of the psychopathic murderers in the world. Well, more like murderer. I also agreed how lucky I was. I mean, when, at the last moment, the mall criminal ran away from the tavern, and I made the switch and handed him my bag with the head I had just cut off. It was lucky for me that he could never notice that I had exchanged my bag for his. Everyone attributed my crimes to him. Now I must stop again for a while. I must not raise suspicions. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode.